You're about to witness the cosmic struggle for free will. The concept of mind control immunity in Marvel Comics was first explored in the Secret Wars storyline, where the Silver Surfer's cosmic awareness and the power cosmic granted him a heightened sense of self and resistance to external influence, setting the stage for a complex theme that would resonate throughout the Marvel Universe. Consider the Hulk, whose unique brain chemistry and rage-filled emotions override any attempts at mental manipulation. This immunity to mind control is not just a product of his powers, but a fundamental aspect of his character, making him a force to be reckoned with in the Marvel Universe. The idea from the threads of heroism, free will, and the human condition. Doctor Strange's mastery of the mystic arts and his use of magical shields and protection spells make him highly immune to mind control. But what does this mean for the nature of heroism and the human experience? As you explore Marvel, you'll discover that the concept of mind control immunity is a nuanced and multifaceted one, with far-reaching implications for the characters and the universe as a whole. The Silver Surfer's immunity to mind control is not just a product of his powers, but also a result of his experiences. His cosmic awareness and connection to the universe make him aware of and resistant to external influences on his mind, allowing him to maintain his sense of self and autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. But what happens when this immunity is put to the test, and the Surfer is faced with an enemy who can manipulate the very fabric of reality? The Hulk's rage-filled emotions are not just a product of his anger, but also a result of his unique brain chemistry. This chemistry makes him highly resistant to mind control, allowing him to override any attempts at mental manipulation and maintain his sense of self. But as you'll see, this immunity is not unique to the Hulk, and other characters in the Marvel Universe have developed their own ways of resisting mind control, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Doctor Strange's magical shields and protection spells are not just a product of his mastery of the mystic arts, but also a result of his experiences. His use of these shields and spells makes him highly immune to mind control, allowing him to protect himself from external influences and maintain his sense of self. But as you'll discover, this immunity is not foolproof, and even the most powerful heroes can be vulnerable to mind control under the right. Immunity is not limited to the Silver Surfer, the Hulk, and Doctor Strange. Other characters, like the Sentry, have demonstrated immunity to mind control due to their vast, reality-warping powers. But what does this mean for the nature of power and free will in the Marvel Universe? And how do these characters' abilities shape the world around them? The one above all, the supreme deity in the Marvel multiverse, is beyond human comprehension and manipulation. This makes him the most powerful being in the Marvel Universe, with abilities that surpass even the most powerful heroes. But what implications does this have for the concept of mind control immunity? And how do the actions of the one above all shape Marvel? Legion's multiple personalities and reality-warping abilities make him highly resistant to mind control. This makes him a unique and powerful hero in the Marvel Universe, with abilities that set him apart from other heroes. But as you'll see, Legion's powers are not just a product of his abilities, but also a result of his experiences and the world around him. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has also explored the concept of mind control immunity, with characters like Black Panther and Thanos demonstrating immunity to mind control. Thanos' immense power and ability to perceive and manipulate reality on a cosmic scale make him highly resistant to mind control. But as you'll see, even Thanos' powers have limitations, and the concept of mind control immunity is not always a guarantee of safety or security. The Scarlet Witch's reality-altering powers were able to bypass even the most powerful hero's immunity to mind control. This demonstrates that there are limits to their resistance, and that even the most powerful heroes can be affected by mind control. Other characters, like from the Space Ignite and Khazar, have also demonstrated immunity to mind control. These characters' unique abilities and experiences make them resistant to mental manipulation. But what does this mean for the nature of heroism and the human condition in the Marvel Universe? Moon Knight's multiple personalities and use of magical and technological enhancements make him highly resistant to mind control. Cable's use of telepathic shielding and his ability to perceive and manipulate time make him immune to mind control. But what implications does this have for the concept of mind control immunity? And how do Cable's powers shape Marvel? Deadpool's regenerative abilities and unpredictable nature make him highly resistant to mind control. But what does this mean for the nature of heroism and the human condition in the Marvel Universe? And how do Deadpool's powers shape the world around him? Namor's Atlantean physiology and connection to the ocean's energy make him immune to mind control. Speedball's kinetic energy powers and ability to perceive and manipulate probability make him highly resistant to mind control. The concept of mind control immunity is a complex and multifaceted theme that adds depth and nuance to the Marvel Universe. It's a reminder that even the most powerful heroes can be vulnerable to mind control, and that the struggle for free will is an ongoing one. But what does this mean for the future of the Marvel Universe? And how will the concept of mind control immunity continue to shape Marvel? The concept of mind control immunity in Marvel Comics is not just a plot device, but a reflection of the creator's intent to explore deeper themes. As writer Claremont notes, the idea of mind control immunity is often used to explore the idea of free will and the nature of heroism. But what does this mean for the role of the writer in shaping the Marvel Universe? And how do the creator's intentions shape Marvel? Claremont's work on the X-Men comics, particularly in the 1980s, showcased the struggle for free will in the face of mind control. His character development and storylines continue to influence the Marvel Universe, as seen in the Secret Wars storyline, which introduced the concept of mind control immunity. Jonathan Hickman, another prominent Marvel writer, also explores the theme of identity and self in his work. He notes that the concept of mind control immunity is meant to explore the idea of identity and the nature of self. The Marvel Comics editors also play a crucial role in shaping the concept of mind control immunity. Tom Brevoort, a longtime Marvel editor, notes that the concept is often used to create tension and conflict within the Marvel Universe. Brevoort's work on this Secret Invasion storyline, which revealed several heroes to be immune to the Skrulls' shape-shifting and mind control abilities, demonstrates the importance of mind control immunity in creating conflict and tension. Andy Schmidt, another Marvel editor, also notes that the concept of mind control immunity is used to create tension and conflict. Schmidt's work on the House of M storyline, which showcased the reality-altering powers of the Scarlet Witch, highlights the limitations of mind control immunity. The concept of mind control immunity has also been explored in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU. The character of Black Panther, with his use of the heart-shaped herb, has demonstrated immunity to mind control. The MCU's portrayal of mind control immunity is not limited to Black Panther. The character of Thanos, with his immense power and ability to perceive and manipulate reality, has also shown resistance to mind control. The MCU's exploration of mind control immunity adds a new layer of depth to the concept, highlighting the complexities of power and free will in the Marvel Universe. The character of Rom the Space Ignite, introduced in the 1970s, has a built-in resistance to mind control due to his alien technology and cybernetic enhancements. Rom's resistance to mind control is a key aspect of his character, allowing him to operate independently and make his own decisions, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The concept of mind control immunity in Rom's character highlights the importance of technology and cybernetic enhancements in the Marvel Universe, and how these elements can be used to create complex and nuanced characters. The character of Khazar, introduced in the 1970s, has demonstrated immunity to mind control through his connection to the natural world and his ability to tap into the Earth's energy. Khazar's connection to the natural world allows him to operate on a different level, making him resistant to mind control and other forms of manipulation. The concept of mind control immunity in Khazar's character highlights the importance of the natural world and the Earth's energy in the Marvel Universe, and how these elements can be used to create complex and nuanced characters. The character of Cable, introduced in the 1980s, has demonstrated immunity to mind control through his use of telepathic shielding and his ability to perceive and manipulate time. The concept of mind control immunity in Cable's character highlights the importance of telepathic shielding and time manipulation in the Marvel Universe, and how these elements can be used to create complex and nuanced characters. The character of Moon Knight, introduced in the 1980s, has been shown to be highly resistant to mind control due to his multiple personalities and his use of magical and technological enhancements. But what does this mean for the concept of mind control immunity, and how do Moon Knight's powers shape Marvel? The concept of mind control immunity in Moon Knight's character highlights the importance of multiple personalities and magical and technological enhancements in the complex and nuanced characters. Here is the rewritten script. You're looking at Deadpool, a character introduced in the 1990s, who's proven to be highly resistant to mind control. His regenerative abilities and unpredictable nature make him a wild card, and that's what makes him so hard to manipulate. Consider this: a character who can heal from any injury and thinks on his feet is a nightmare to control. That's why his immunity to mind control is so significant. The concept of mind control immunity in Deadpool's character highlights the importance of regenerative abilities and unpredictability in the Marvel Universe. But that's not all. It also shows how these elements can be used to create complex and nuanced characters. You see, when a character is unpredictable, they're harder to control, and that's what makes them and vulnerability, and it's what makes Deadpool so fascinating. Now, let's talk about the Marvel Comics character with the most consistent immunity to mind control, the One Above All. This supreme deity is beyond human comprehension and manipulation, and that's what makes him so powerful. You can't control what you can't understand, and the One Above All is the ultimate example of that. His immunity to mind control is not just a trait, it's a fundamental aspect of his character. The One Above All's immunity to mind control is a key aspect of his character, making him the most powerful being in the Marvel multiverse. But what does that mean exactly? It means that he's not just immune to mind control, he's also immune to influence, manipulation, and coercion. He's the ultimate authority, and his power is unmatched. And that raises an interesting question. What happens when you're faced with a being who's beyond your control? The concept of mind control immunity in the One Above All's character highlights the importance of divine power and omnipotence in the Marvel Universe. But it also raises interesting questions about the nature of power and control. When you're dealing with a being who's all-powerful, the concept of mind control becomes almost meaningless. And that's what makes the One Above All so fascinating. He's a character who challenges our assumptions about power and control. The concept of mind control immunity has been explored in various Marvel comic storylines, including the Kree-Skrull War and the Korvac Saga. These storylines introduce the idea of heroes with natural or acquired resistance to mental manipulation, and that's what makes them so compelling. You see, when you're dealing with characters who are resistant to mind control, you're dealing with characters who are truly free. And that's what makes these storylines so fascinating. The Kree-Skrull War storyline, which ran from 1971 to 1972, showcased the importance of mind control immunity in creating conflict and tension within the Marvel Universe. And that's what makes this storyline so compelling. It's an exploration of the limits of power and control. The Korvac Saga, which ran in 1975, further explored the concept of mind control immunity, highlighting the complexities of power and free will in the Marvel Universe. But it also raised interesting questions about the nature of identity and self. And that's what makes this storyline so fascinating. It's an exploration of the human condition. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU, has also explored the concept of mind control immunity, introducing the idea of heroes with natural or acquired resistance to mental manipulation to a wider audience. It means that the MCU is exploring the same themes and ideas as the comics, but in a different way. And that's what makes the MCU so compelling. It's a fresh take on familiar characters and storylines. The MCU's portrayal of mind control immunity, as seen in the character of Black Panther, highlights the importance of mental resilience and resistance to manipulation. When you're dealing with a character who's resistant to mind control, you're dealing with a character who's truly powerful. And that's what makes Black Panther so fascinating. He's a character who embodies the idea of mental resilience. The MCU's exploration of mind control immunity, as seen in the character of Thanos, highlights the complexities of power and free will in the Marvel Universe. And that's what makes Thanos so fascinating. He's a character who embodies the idea of self-awareness. The creators of Marvel Comics have played a crucial role in shaping the concept of mind control immunity, using it to explore deeper themes and ideas within the Marvel Universe. It means that the creators are using the concept of mind control immunity to explore the human condition, to explore the nature of power, control, and identity. And that's what makes their work so compelling. It's an exploration of the complexities of human nature. Chris Claremont, a longtime Marvel writer, has used the concept of mind control immunity to explore the idea of free will and the nature of heroism in his work. But he's not just exploring the concept. He's also challenging our assumptions about power and control. And that's what makes Claremont's work so fascinating. It's an exploration of the limits of power and control. Jonathan Hickman, another prominent Marvel writer, has used the concept of mind control immunity to explore the idea of identity and the nature of self in his work. But he's not just exploring the concept. He's also challenging our assumptions about the nature of reality. And that's what makes Hickman's work so fascinating. It's an exploration of the complexities of human identity. The concept of mind control immunity has been used to create tension and conflict within the Marvel Universe. But that's not all. It's also been used to explore deeper. Immunity has been used to create complex and nuanced characters within the Marvel Universe, highlighting the importance of mental resilience and resistance to manipulation. It means that the characters are not just powerful, they're also vulnerable. And that's what makes them so compelling. They're human. The character of Wolverine, with his healing factor and adamantium-laced skeleton, has demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful and complex character. It's what makes him so compelling. He's a character who's truly himself. The character of Doctor Strange, with his mastery of the mystic arts and magical shields, has also demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful and complex character. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU, has also introduced complex and nuanced characters with mind control immunity, highlighting the importance of mental resilience and resistance to manipulation. The character of Black Panther, with his use of the heart-shaped herb, has demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful and complex character. The character of Thanos, with his immense power and ability to perceive and manipulate reality, has also demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful. Immunity has been used to explore deeper themes and ideas within the Marvel Universe, highlighting the complexities of power and free will. But that's not all. It's also been used to create complex and nuanced characters. The creators of Marvel Comics have continued to explore the concept of mind control immunity, using it to create complex and nuanced characters and storylines within the Marvel Universe. The character of the Silver Surfer, with his cosmic awareness and the power cosmic, has demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful and complex character. The character of the Sentry, with his vast, reality-warping powers, has also demonstrated immunity to mind control, making him a powerful and complex character. Note that this is just one possible continuation of the script, and there are many other directions that the script could take. The goal is to continue the script in a way that is consistent with the existing sections and adds new insights and perspectives to the concept of mind control immunity. But that's not all. It's also to explore the complexities of the Marvel Universe and the characters that inhabit it. As we've seen with the Silver Surfer and the Sentry, mind control immunity is a complex theme in Marvel Comics, and according to editor Tom Brevoort, it's often used to create tension and conflict within the Marvel Universe. It means that the concept of mind control immunity is not just a trait, it's a fundamental aspect of the Marvel Universe. It's what makes the characters so compelling. They're human. One creator who has explored mind control immunity extensively is Claremont, who has stated that the concept is meant to explore the idea of free will and the nature of heroism. Another character who has demonstrated immunity to mind control is Khazar, whose connection to the natural world and ability to tap into the Earth's energy make him a unique case. It means that Khazar's immunity is not just a trait, it's a fundamental aspect of his character. Khazar's immunity to mind control is also closely tied to his physical and emotional connection to the savage land, which has been depicted as a place of primal power and instinct. The character of Moon Knight is another example of a hero with complex immunity to mind control, thanks to his multiple personalities and use of magical and technological enhancements. Moon Knight's multiple personalities can be seen as both a strength and a weakness with mind control, as they create a kind of mental redundancy that makes it harder for external forces to manipulate his mind. The character of Cable, with his use of telepathic shielding and ability to perceive and manipulate time, has also demonstrated immunity to mind control. Cable's immunity to mind control is closely tied to his ability to think and act on a different timescale than most humans, which allows him to anticipate and counter mental attacks. The character of Deadpool, with his regenerative abilities and unpredictable nature, has also shown a high degree of resistance to mind control. Deadpool's immunity to mind control is closely tied to his ability to think and act outside the norms of conventional heroism, which makes it harder for external forces to predict and manipulate his actions. The 6 Marvel heroes immune to mind control are proof of the complexity and diversity of the Marvel Universe. Each character's unique abilities and experiences make them resistant to mental manipulation, and their stories have been explored in various storylines and adaptations. It means that the concept of mind control immunity is a fundamental aspect of the Marvel Universe. It's what makes the characters so compelling. From the Silver Surfer to Deadpool, these heroes have demonstrated that they are not just powerful, but also immune to mind control. Their stories have captivated audiences and inspired new generations of fans, and their legacy will continue to shape the Marvel Universe. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more hero lore content. Join us next time as we explore more of the Marvel Universe and its complex characters and storylines. But that's not all. It's also an invitation to explore the complexities of the human condition and the nature of power and control. And that's what makes the Marvel Universe so fascinating. It's an exploration of the human experience.